Good morning. Welcome back to B-Sides. This is Breaking Ground. Before we kick off, I have a few quick announcements. First of all, I'd like to thank our sponsors, especially LastPass, Palo Alto Networks, and our gold sponsors, Amazon, Intel, Blue Cat. It's their support that makes this possible. Because these talks are being live streamed, the camera's right there, please turn off your cell phones. Because we are in person, please keep your masks on. So with that, please welcome Matt and Rock.
Hey everyone, good morning. If you saw the keynote this morning, hopefully what you have over the next hour, probably not going to go that long, are complementary to a lot of the things that Mr. Hoff had. So in my experience, every great talk starts off when you insult a large portion of the audience, if not all of the audience. And let's do that. So there are some of you in the crowd, or those watching online, that either do not have a threat model that you're defending against in your home environment, your work environment. And there are some of you that absolutely have an antiquated threat model. And what do I mean by that? That you're still looking at the insider threats, the nation state actors, the criminal actors that wish to deploy crypto miners in your network. Yes, those are all viable threats that you need to be concerned about. But there's a more nefarious one that we believe you should pay more attention to. And this is a threat that has access to all of your emails. It has access to all of your workstations, your servers, your routers, your switches, your net flow, all of your bring your own devices. And more importantly, this is one that you probably paid several $1 million to put in the network, welcoming it into your environment. So what am I talking about? I'm talking about the security appliances and solutions that are there that you rely on for your security. In the event that there is a 0-day, in the event that there is a compromise of one of these trusted solutions, these have perfect access in your environment. And over the next several slides, we're going to talk about ways that you can, even with a 0-day, you can't stop that 0-day. But what can you do to mitigate the impact to your organization when you have an appliance with damn near perfect access to your enterprise? So with that, we're going to go through everyone's favorite talk, compliance. Everyone loves that. What are some implications of having these work from home scenarios? We'll go through a very common exploit vector into your environment. We'll have a guy checking for things.
Just looking for a spare mic.
Yep. And we'll also talk about the newfangled AI ML that people are moving towards in enterprise environments. So on to compliance. So these are, if we're lucky, once a year, people within their environments will take a look at them because it's audit time. These are extremely prescriptive. They're going to tell you what to do and where to have it. But what's going to leave up to you is to figure out how to do it securely. How do you do it in a manner that is actually not inducing more risk in your environment? And another thing that you have to worry about is, what are you actually attempting to secure with these compliance standards? And like I said earlier, it's really the old threat model, the insider threats, maybe. Some of the compliance standards don't actually consider that. A lot of it is, security at the perimeter. But now there's things like the cloud, and so the compliance standards don't really incorporate that as well. And I have not seen a compliance standard to date that actually accounts for when a mandated security solution is the point of vulnerability. What do you do at that point? The good news is that we can actually rationalize this threat, and we can identify that, yes, we must do these things to stay compliant based off federal, state, local standards. However, we can understand the implications within our environment and what is not covered. And so you can take these very abstract, very broad requirements and build something that's more tailored, a complementary checklist that allows you to go in and actually define the individual things you need to be looking for based off of your architecture, based off the security applications, based off the software that you're running in your environment. And then based off that, hopefully what you've done is create something that's usable. something that you look at more than once a year. Who knows, maybe monthly, right? And it allows you to stay ahead of emerging threats because it's internally developed and it's useful. So some things have happened in the world since 2020. I have seen some compliance standards that have not been updated since 2014, but we are still required to adhere to those 2014 standards despite things being different at work. And so with that, Matt's going to talk a little bit about some of those changes.
All right, good morning, everybody. So Rock presented to you some of the old modeling and what we're doing as professionals, security professionals. But how does that feed into our organizational mission, right? We can isolate ourselves and say, my job is to just look at these dashboards, look at the systems that tell me day to day what is actually happening, like with my alerts and with that structure. But going forward, the challenge as we go through this presentation is to marry that to your organization's mission to then inform them of new models to follow, new threats to advise them on, and a way to structure it out so that it's not a burden to you and to go back to I got to go back and rebuild this whole 2014 model. Not necessarily, no, right? It's laborious to do those things, but if we understand the context of the mission that our organization is doing and our mission, we can then provide more agile, responsive measures to then manage these threats and model them, right? So we're going to give two examples, and for one is the work from home model, right? So we've, over the last 2 years with COVID, had integrated this work from home systems into our networks. Now, when we did that, we took a lot of managed and assumed risk for the end user. We're like, okay, we're going to purchase this resource that we're not going to own, but we're going to rely on it to provide them access into our networks, right? That structure and that management, are we 100% aware of what the implications of that are, right, as security practitioners? And for me, as I was going through this, the answer was no, right? People started managing things differently. The net flow was odd. People were touching different things that we weren't aware of because of the structure that we had put in place. So our understanding had changed. We went back and tried to look at our baseline, and well, we had to do one, but was it as robust? No, it met the prescriptive measures of my yearly requirements to then answer those questions, be like, okay, this is what it does, this is generally what people are doing, here's what's happening. Well, there were massive deviations when we started integrating this work from home model, right? We had IT and we had HR accessing the networks externally to internal. So now we have to make a comparative analysis of understanding what the implications of that are, right? And start building a model for threats relative to that. So then security changed, our context changed. And that's a difficult problem to overcome because reframing and understanding holistically what is now critical versus what was critical is different, right? It was easy on-prem to say, HR, you're just going to be doing these things with these things. IT, you'll do this with that. I can manage that, I can monitor that. But it changed. Well, now we have to support HR accessing multiple different things, different people with different software, with different devices tying into this VPN concentrator, then accessing. I can't necessarily manage those things right now because I didn't take that into account as I was building this work from home structure. So as I try to understand what threat modeling is and understanding the data, making sure it's one common information model, making sure I can understand it and then advise people on it. And then also impart security practices on top of that was very difficult. So then the impact was massive, right? It was very hard to then understand, okay, if they do gain access to whatever our VPN concentrator is, when are they going to let us know? And who does it impact? And how big is that impact going to be to what they touch on my infrastructure, right? That's a massive lift to say your organization might have 100 people in HR, right? And they're touching several different things I didn't expect them to do. But have I taken that into account to understand the data? So what can we do? How can we respond at the end of that long road? And how can we understand it? Am I going to say, destroy it and rebuild it now that you have the understanding? No, because it's not feasible. It's too much to say, hey, as security practitioners, we now understand, hindsight being 2020, we need to tear it down and build it back up. Well, I don't know if you're going to keep anybody who's going to be like, I just worked on this thing for 2 years. It was fine 2 years ago. Why am I going to rebuild it? Well, let's just apply some principles that we can then manage and monitor and integrate to our day-to-day to have a better holistic understanding. And one of those principles is just enough administration in PowerShell, right? As a security practitioner and having people external come into my environment, I want to understand and define what they're functionally capable of doing so I can monitor it. And if something is outside of those bounds, I can then respond to it in a more agile manner. Now, with just enough administration, we can define groups that over time have become bloated, right? But we can give them the responsibilities of using specific modules or specific commandlets to do whatever they need to do, right? And if they come to us and say, that thing I was doing last week isn't working, what did you do? What did you change? Well, maybe I didn't have an understanding and inventory of what it is you were trying to accomplish. So now they're in a roundabout way advising me as to how their interactions on that network are going to impact me, right? Not just as the manager of IT personnel, but as an advisor to those that purchase products, right? Integrate products, integrate solutions, right? If we're just building on building on building with a product and we're taking the human thought and the decision-making away from your junior analysts or your junior IT specialists, well, you're not staying ahead of the curve, realistically. You're just maintaining the status quo, that prescribed measures that are necessary, because that's what keeps your job going, but it's not progressive. It's not keeping you ahead of the adversary in this type of work-from-home environment, right? Signing scripts is a simple solution as well. You can manage and track them, right? You now understand as, let's say an adversary gets into your network and wants to lock down the entire enterprise by pushing out a script to then, encrypt everything for ransom. Well, if you're signing your scripts and you've denied the access of unsigned scripts, you've now imposed a cost of time on an adversary, right? And now we're building a slog, a quagmire into our networks, but it's a designed one. We understand it because we're designing it. We're imparting these principles, right? We need to define who our trusted hosts are. When we built the work-from-home model, initially there was a lot of, well, we got to let them do what they got to do. We don't understand how they're doing. Like HR is telling us logically how they're doing it, but how are they doing it? How is IT doing it, right? Well, okay, they need to touch a lot of stuff, so let's just give them access to touch a lot of stuff. But when it comes back to that baseline deviation and what they're actually doing, have we gone back and refined it? Because if our adversaries are there, they are. They're absolutely doing that. They're getting ahead of you as individuals, right? You as an organization, you as a team, because you're taking prescribed measures but not defined measures, right? And then isolating remote systems, understanding why Steve has to come in via one jump box and that he told his whole team that he has to do that same thing when we have 17 different, right? Now isolation and understanding to then make more documented, refined, and defined decisions. We can then impart all four of these onto our network and respond more effectively, advise more effectively, and build out models that aren't burdensome, right? And then we also don't have to tell our leaders, hey, this thing doesn't work because when we built it, we missed too much. So that we can then enable and empower our teams to then be like, well, this is a new way of doing it. We can impart this on there. This is a new function or feature that we need. And those advisements make what we're trying to do more effective, and we don't always have to start over.
Yeah, so again, back to the whole principle of this talk. This is not a, if you do this, you'll be successful list. This is a subset of what you could be doing. But again, it's about checks and balances. If you are implementing these controls in your environment, what it's going to do is provide some mitigation against a 0-day against your VPN concentrator. But now what happens when one of these have been compromised? It's always iterative, right? So if you are allowing only signed scripts, what happens when the adversary can now sign scripts and deploy throughout your network? Do you understand the baseline, the additions, the unauthorized additions, the deviations from all of these activities? Someone just added a new host, a new trusted host overnight. Who did it? Why? Is there change management in the environment that's robust enough to account for these anomalies?
So then we're going to go to a more defined model, right? So when it came to Exchange server abuse with proxy logon, there's plenty of documentation of when the after effects of that event, right? We identify that our Exchange servers are internet facing. We know that Shodan exists. We know that there's an API that's going to be scanning for something. Whether it's an icon with an MD5 hash that's tied to a version of a vulnerable system or server, right? They're then going to take that and they'll use CVE trends on Twitter and be like, okay, does this apply? Can I use this resource? Is there a POC that exists on GitHub that I can then leverage and use on this environment, right? Then they're going to aim for privileged access and remote code execution, right? But their ultimate end state isn't just that privileged access. It's they're leveraging the peers and the trust relationships that we all have defined because of how the enterprise has to work, right? We have to support these relationships to then manage, monitor, keep up to date, understand the health and welfare of these systems, but they're also interconnected throughout my enterprise. My admins are going there because there's no fault tolerance. We have a load balanced system with 8 Exchange servers, a primary and an alternate, and they're going to these boxes, right? How are they doing it? Why are they doing it this way? Are they using RDP, right? Are they using secure RDP because they're trying to do a 2-hop jump which is difficult with standard RDP? Or are they doing it in some other way, right? Now, our goal as defenders is not to disrupt those essential services, but it is to inform and advise to then protect them. And like I said, provide that quagmire for an adversary to then impose the cost, the cost of time on them so we can get ahead of it and we can understand it. So when things start happening that are outside those bounds, those left and rights that we have defined, we can then answer them. So I looked at a few things for this, right? And I know I just mentioned, like, they're using RDP. Well, they need to stop. Like, it's controversial, but stop doing it, right? We can start using OpenSSH with Windows, for Windows, right? And we can tunnel through the network and use it for both domain joined and non-domain joined, right? So we updated our modeling. We said, okay, if we're going to be doing these things and we're going to try to stay ahead of the curve, how can we do that if we're doing these prescribed measures that were there 3 years ago? Our adversary, if he or she is there, they've been there for a while, right? They know, they're aware. So we change, we modify, and we adapt, right? Now, change frequently. And I know what you're thinking. I know what NIST says about Steve changing his password is not great practice. But we're not telling Steve to change his password. We're looking at it from a organizational and a team perspective, right? So regularly updating local administrator and global service account passwords, cool. And then regularly roll Kerberos every 45 days. And you're like, these are simple. We know that the golden and silver tickets are going to exist. We have integrated systems that are legacy that aren't necessarily very, the question hasn't really been answered, right, for those systems because we've integrated them into our new features, but we don't have the team that understands the legacy systems and their integration, right? So we need to understand that, just like certain viruses and diseases, they're going to come back, right? So if we're not paying attention to them and making simple solutions a part of our day-to-day and our process, then the argument can be made that it's going to be leveraged. We need to go back. It's just an example of going back and understanding what was relevant, what are we seeing, and how can we defend against it when it becomes relevant again, right? It's iterative. And we should be able to understand and document those things and build them up over time. Now, the big picture, SIEM data integration. We're ingesting data into our SIEM solution all the time. But what I haven't seen in my job was we weren't integrating the IT team solutions or the local defender solutions into these data sets. We were saying, oh, they're doing whatever they're doing. We're doing script block logging, but are we looking at what it is? Are they signed? And if not, why aren't they? How do we define those things and integrate them into the SIEM so that we can then do checks and balances on ourselves so that those that do have access to that Splunk enterprise solution, when they get access to that admin, do they not have access to Splunk as well, right? How can we understand that? How can we audit that? We need to provide those solutions into what we do. Or I would say we are the problem. We're advising, but we're not checking ourselves towards that advisement that we're making, right? We're like, oh, HR is doing something weird, but maybe sometimes we're doing something weird too, and we need to be aware of that. Now, as I said, the leveraging peers for trust relationships. So hear me out, right? Bloodhound is a fantastic tool. At the end of all of these things, you understand what the adversary is trying to do. Even going back to the principles of work from home, you defined it all. You have admins running everywhere. You have users accessing things. You have sessions existing here and there. You have all of this stuff happening. But how do you provide somebody the so what? Right? I can tell you all day, there's Microsoft has a bunch of scripts that'll remotely query my Active Directory, pull down these relationships, and map them out for me. But that's a lot. It's a lot to digest and a lot to manage, right? So I would argue using Bloodhound is one of the best ways to graphically represent those trust relationships, the interactions on your enterprise, and there's a lot of functionality and modularity to cater to what you're trying to accomplish. Because you may not be responsible for the entirety of your enterprise, but for the areas that you are responsible for, to provide that so what to somebody, to get their buy-in, not just being like, well, we could just buy something, right? And cut you out, and then you have to learn that new tool or resource. No, you should be the ones providing that so what to your leaders and managing that so what, right? Presenting it, so hey, we have a person over here that we didn't account for, they had 13 sessions. What we did was we managed that, and now the adversary has to choose a different path. Not quite defined every time, but at least we know where we are putting roadblocks and where we're applying the quagmire, right? Pass it over to Rock.
All right, so again, it's about intent. So an attacker wants to use the trusted relationships not because of where it lands them, but because of where they can go. They want to deploy the crypto miner. They want to deploy the ransomware throughout the entirety of the network. So how do we proactively visualize where they could go? And it's about, again, a couple slides back, we had the model of, do you know where your critical assets and critical systems are? If you don't, Bloodhound is one mechanism that could provide you a way to visualize that. But also, where are the noisy systems? What are the systems that are talking, with 10,000 open connections running at admin? Why are you doing that? Like, do we know this, or was this some admin that was just trying to automate their job so they can drink coffee and play video games all day? And from that, to have the data presented from Bloodhound actually presents a heat map where you can quantifiably say where your critical systems, critical connections are, and actually do like an exploit control flow graph of, upon here, they could enumerate here, here, and here based off of the existing trusted relationships. So again, the sludge, the slog, to actually incorporate barriers along that way to make it as slow as possible. So in a smaller environment, this becomes doable. When you have these massive enterprises that span multiple states, multiple countries, and you're dealing in petabytes of data a day, how do you do this? So it becomes really enticing to start, investing in AI ML solutions that can, automatically reason based off of some ground truth what is benign and what is malicious. So you're not going to be safe just because you're using next-gen solutions, right? So at its core, these are just one more appliance that could potentially be a point of vulnerability. An RCE in your AI ML solution presents the attacker an opportunity to change the ground truth, to say what is benign, what is stealthily right on through. But let's assume your appliance is never going to be exploited, that it's going to be perfect all along. There are other ways an attacker can influence the classification of the data it's looking at, and it's a field of study called adversarial machine learning. So let's talk about false negatives first. This is where an attacker wants to slide in undetected. So what it can do is actually find a benign file, benign artifact, and to start inducing changes on that file, and to introduce it to the ML solution. Like, hey, this is fine. And it's going to slowly nudge it down to the actually full-on weaponization of that file, where it is the exploit, it is the inject into the environment. But because the AI ML solution has seen it thousands, millions of times, it has been trained to say that this is okay. I've seen this a million times. It's just Bob from accounting. Let him on in. And that's how you actually train those classifiers to let benign things in without it flagging. Now let's talk about the noise, the false positives. This is where an attacker wants you to lose confidence in your solutions, that you have alert saturation, where it's like, oh, this damn thing doesn't work. I don't believe in it. It's because they've done things like, behaviors on startup are now being flagged as malicious. Default Windows system files are now automatically popping up across the entire environment as malicious. the admin now loses confidence in the appliance that allows then the attacker to slide in through the noise. That we now know that we're generating 10,000 alerts a day. No one's looking at it. The logs are rolling. They only have a retention of 1,000 logs. Chances are no one's going to see me come in. And these are the type of, AI ML could be a value added to your environment, but you need to understand the implications therein. All right, so throughout this talk, we've talked a number of things that you could do to assume that the most trusted security solutions in your environment may potentially be the point of vulnerability. And because of the trusted relationships, someone's going to abuse it to own your entire network. We have a list of things that we can provide you, both online and a hidden slide, that are some references that you can look at what makes sense to your organization. But again, it's not about one solution fixing everything. It is iterative. It is understanding the implications of your actions and assuming that no good deed goes unpunished. That someone's going to exploit your signed script policy. Someone's going to exploit your ML solution. Always wear your red team hat, even as a defender, and assume something will go wrong. So with that, we can take any questions, comments, concerns. Like I said, we do have some resources, and Matt has about another 5 pages that we'll add on in the Twitter version that we upload later. So please, also, this is Matt's first InfoSec conference. So if we give him a little hand. But yeah, any questions y'all want to do, we can do that. And then if there are no public questions, we can stand on the side. So about half an hour before the next one kicks off. So any questions? Please. So is the next talk going to be about adversarial machine learning? So about 2015, I wrote a paper on the implications therein. It's called Summoning Demons. So it's online. Where it's actually within your trusted solution, and it talks about a number of threat models like passing floats and doubles causing enough loss of confidence that you actually sway a classifier if you're not programming safely to actually account for additional decimal spots, things like that. But yeah, so Summoning Demons is a paper that you can check out on more of that topic. And again, there's about 1 million other papers in the field that could talk to you more about ways that you can abuse the oracle, abuse the classifier to do bad things. Any other questions? Please.
So I guess one of the things that I was wondering about during the talk was, I guess I don't know if you have any guidance as far as how you go about not rebuilding from scratch.
Yeah.
Like, how do you go about improving what you have?
So I'm gonna let Matt take this one. We did about a 2-hour conversation last night about this. And so to repeat the question, so some of these things are going to break your environment or could potentially break your environment. Or like, hey, at some point, when do you need to nuke the entire network and just start from scratch? So Matt.
So in what I've done throughout my career as I advise and understand these networks and see that the solutions that we would want to provide are never so burdensome to the customer, right? The local defenders, that they can't functionally do their job and you have to rebuild the environment, right? The solutions are aggressive. Taking measured steps between each one, but first identifying why you're there, what you're doing, what the real question is. The work from home model is a great example, right? I didn't have to nuke, even though they wanted to. Like the question was, do we just have to move everybody back in? Like, do we have to bring them back in for the on-prem? Like, it's like, no. Like, you're assuming a lot of risk, sure, but somebody is managing and assessing where that risk is, where's that documentation? And the answer is no, there's no documentation. Okay. So let's define what that is, right? You're trying to just enable people to get in, right? And you're understanding as we go through modeling where those faults are, then you can take measured steps to defend against them. Like just enough administration, it is going to break some stuff initially. It's going to happen. because you're defining, if you don't put the right commandlets in there, it's going to deny all commandlets explicitly. So you use nothing. But if you pick and discern what you're trying to accomplish and take a measured step through it, involve your IT teams, involve your administrators and your local defenders. Those answers are easy to overcome, that you don't have to rebuild it. Because sometimes what they're saying to you is, hey, we're using these Microsoft scripts to do X, Y, and Z, but this is the functionality we need with them, not the whole thing. Here's the variables that we pass in. We can define those variables, right? We can define the access and the means and the approach that they have. They're all using one jump box, so that's the only one they're aware of. Well, that's a failure on our part to inform them, right? The only time it ever becomes a nuclear problem is when we've defined, as we're going through it, they had an incident response a year ago, and they said that they cleared it because they used this measure to get in, like proxy logon. They got in, but they cleared it, and it wasn't actually a true clear, and then they built more infrastructure on the backbone of it. And it's like, well, they logically obliterated your trust relationships and are everywhere. They're to be not trusted anymore, right? Then you can talk about principles of rebuilding. But it's usually not that aggressive, and it's usually just providing the little measured steps one at a time. It's not an overnight solution. It is a stepped solution with decision points throughout that we have to, I mean, the previous talk said it great. Like, we don't enable people to provide those decision points for us and the guidance because they're working the mission. If you enroll them in it, you generally, I don't want to say never, but you generally don't have to nuke whatever solution they provided. You can advise them and assume risk in certain areas, and then they can enhance it over time. And that's really what the principles are for. And then managing your team and allowing people to take measured steps for them, for their protection. Anybody else have any other questions? Great.
All right, we'll go over here if you have anything to say. Yeah, thanks.